Good evening. My name is Matthew. I'm one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. I used to be a tax collector until Jesus came and introduced himself to me, and he gave me an invitation that changed my life forever as he asked me to follow him. And I did. I left my home, I left my family, I left everything, and I followed him. And I want to give an account for you this evening about the events that led to his death. And we're going to start at the dinner that we had with Simon the leper. Well, he used to be a leper until he met Jesus. And Jesus healed him. Jesus was constantly healing people and loving people and giving of himself to people freely. Dinner was going great. We're having a good time hanging out together at Simon the leper's house until all of a sudden this woman came in. And she did something that, I'll be honest with you, was hard to watch. She took an expensive jar of perfume and she poured it on Jesus' feet. And it was hard to watch that because, again, I left everything to follow Jesus. We all had. So we didn't have a whole lot of money. We often traveled great distances. We ate very little. And that jar of perfume could have very easily bought us a warm place to sleep and a meal to eat. It was hard to watch it. Judas couldn't stand it. He said, "Jesus, why the waste?" And Jesus replied to Judas, "Leave her alone, Judas. She's done a beautiful thing for me." I watched as Judas stormed out of the room, and I know now what he was doing then is that he went to the local scribes and the elders and the chief priests. And he said, I want to help you. What will you give me if I help you capture Jesus? And they paid him 30 silver coins. This shocked us because we trusted Judas. Judas was in charge of the money. You know, you put someone in charge of the money that you trust. So I couldn't believe that it was Judas. And truth be told, it could have been any one of us. And the reason I say that is because at the next dinner that we had together, it was the Passover meal. We're sitting together and we're having this meal, and Jesus speaks up and he says, "One of you are going to betray me." And every single one of us asked Jesus, "Is it I?" And you wouldn't ask him that question if you at least hadn't thought about turning him in yourself. He went down the line, he said no to everybody, and then finally Judas spoke up and he says, "Is it I?" Jesus replied, "Yes, my friend, it's you." Judas got up and he walked away. Again, we were all in shock. Couldn't believe it. I remember I felt sorry for Judas as he walked out because it could have been me. And as I'm having this thought, Jesus begins to speak kind of in a strange way. He takes this loaf of bread and he says, "This is my body, broken for you." He said, "As often as you eat this meal together, do this in remembrance of me." And likewise, he took a cup and he said, "This is my blood, and the blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. As often as you drink this cup, do this in remembrance of me." And so one by one, we ate the bread and we drank the cup. And then Jesus began to lead us in a song of worship about the goodness of the Father. And it was a welcomed moment of worship, especially with everything that had just gone on with Judas. When we had finished eating the meal together and worshiping, Jesus got up and he walked out of the room. And we all did what we always did, and we followed him out of the room, and he led us to the Mount of Olives. I remember it was a cold night, and I looked up in the darkness of the night, and the sky was lit with stars, and it was beautiful, and we all just stood there in silence for a moment until Jesus spoke again. More bad news. He said, "On this night, every one of you will flee from me. For it is written, 'Strike the shepherd and the sheep shall scatter.'" Well, nobody could call Peter weak. Not even Jesus. And Peter began to rebuke him. "No, Lord, no. No. Even if everyone else falls away from you, I never will." And he swore an oath to Jesus, and he said, "Even if it costs me my life, I'll follow you." Jesus replied, there was hurt in his voice, as he said, "Peter, this very night, before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Jesus continued to walk, and we followed him some more. to a garden called Gethsemane. It was late by this hour. We were all very tired, and we kind of slumped down against this tree, and we fell asleep, and Jesus went off to do what he'd done a lot, which is get alone with the Father and pray. He did this twice, and he woke us up 2 times, and the last time he woke us up, he said, "Can't you watch with me just an hour?" He said, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." I'd seen Jesus pray a lot. I'd never seen him pray that way. And I never heard him pray the kind of prayers that he was praying. He was filled with anxiety and agony. And I heard him pray, and he said, "Father, I don't know if I can do it. Is there any other way?" And then I heard his resolution as I had heard him surrender time and time and time again over the years that I followed him, as he said, "But God, I'll do whatever you want me to do." Jesus came and woke us up a 3rd time. And he said, "The hour has come. Already my captors are at hand." And as Jesus was speaking, we began to hear a loud clamoring coming behind him. And it was dark, so we couldn't see, but we tried to peer into the darkness. And as they came into view, we saw the local elders and chief priests and scribes, and with them an army of soldiers carrying clubs and swords. And we heard them laughing and joking. We could hear the steel clanging against itself. And then all of a sudden, just feet in front of Jesus. It's us, Jesus, and this group of armed men. And they come to a standstill, and everything goes silent. We're peering around Jesus, and all of a sudden the crowd opens up, and out steps Judas. "Hello, my friend," said Jesus. "Rabbi," came the reply. And he kissed Jesus on the cheek. And as soon as he kissed him, a group of violent men grabbed a hold of Jesus, and they began restraining him. And all of a sudden, chaos ensued as Peter grabbed a sword, slashing it here and there, and he ended up chopping off an ear of one of the men. And it was Jesus, of all people, who said, "No, stop, Peter, stop. Don't you know if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword?" And it was Jesus, of all people, who calmed the situation down, and he went willingly with a group of men. They arrested him. It was terrifying. One of the scariest moments of my life. And the rest of the disciples must have had a similar thought that I had. I feared I'd be next. And so I'm ashamed to admit it, but I fled. We all did. If ever there was a moment when Jesus needed someone, it was then. And I abandoned him. As the guards took Jesus out of our sight, I saw Peter turn around, and he began to follow them at a distance, and I followed Peter at a distance. And that we came to this courtyard, and we're trying to figure out what's going on, and all of a sudden it became very clear. They're holding an illegal council meeting. It's illegal for them to meet in secret like this, and it's illegal for them to meet at night like this. And it soon was apparent what they were doing. This was a mock trial. They were bringing forth witness after witness to try to get false testimony against Jesus, but they were having a hard time doing so. And this began to frustrate the chief priest and the elders. And Jesus was silent the whole time until one of the chief priests asked him this in Matthew 26. He was invoking the name of God. He demanded, "Tell us whether or not you are the Son of God, the King of the Jews." Jesus replied, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." And then they spit in his face, and they struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" While this was going on, Peter was in the courtyard. He was trying to keep warm by a fire. And a servant girl recognized him and said, "You're one of the followers of Jesus, weren't you?" He said, "No, you're mistaken. I don't know the man." He walked out of the courtyard and he went to the entrance, and it wasn't long before a second person recognized him and said, You were a follower of Jesus. I recognize you. He said, I swear to God I wasn't. The third person, I know that you're lying. Why are you lying? I can tell even by your accent that you're a Galilean and a follower of Christ. And I couldn't believe the words that came out of Peter's mouth next as he swore and he cursed and he said, damn it, I don't know the man. In that moment, a rooster crowed. And I looked at Peter's face as pangs of regret lined his face as he realized what he had just done. He denied Christ just like he said he would, and he broke his oath that I will follow you no matter what. I watched as Peter ran out, weeping bitterly. That was it for Peter. He was done. And it was about this time that I began to question, what was it all for? What was the point of it all? Jesus, you were supposed to rescue us. You were supposed to redeem us. You were supposed to restore us as a prominent people. What for? What was it? What was the whole point? As this was going on in the courtyard, they were getting the mock trial just right. They continued into the early hours of the morning when at first light, the real trial began. They had to move speedily. They had been trying to destroy Jesus for some time now. Already word of this gathering was getting out, and they wanted to condemn Jesus to death before someone could come and defend him. So as soon as day broke, they held the trial. Everyone said that what they were supposed to say. They lied, they accused him, and they condemned him to death. And then they led Jesus out to Pilate. He's the governor of the area, and they brought forth these accusations and their verdict that they had come to, and Jesus remained silent the entire time. Pilate was amazed. Why won't you defend yourself? Don't you hear the accusations against you? But Jesus was silent like a lamb to the slaughter. Until Pilate asked him the same question that the religious leaders asked him that got him to speak, and Pilate said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You have said so." You could tell Pilate thought Jesus was innocent. He didn't want anything to do with Jesus. He thought that the religious leaders were jealous of Jesus, his following, and his ministry. And so he thought that he would appease him. And I want to remind you that we are living under Roman rule at this time. And they would do things to appease us from time to time, to keep us in line, to show good faith. And one of the things that they would do is at the festival, they would release a prisoner to us just in a show of good faith and to appease us. And he thought to himself, here's what I'll do. I'll stand Jesus, this innocent man, next to Barabbas, this murderer. And surely they will see in light of this murderer that Jesus is innocent and this has gone too far. But the religious leaders were wise to Pilate's plan, and they began to use their influence, voicing with authority, you need to vote against Jesus, and they swayed the vote against him. And so when Pilate stood up and he said, who would you have me release to you today, Jesus or Barabbas? The crowd began to shout, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. And Pilate motioned for the crowd to be silent. And he said, you've got to be kidding me. What has Jesus done? And they shouted all the louder, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. Pilate was losing control of the crowd, and he feared that a riot would break out. Had a hard time getting them to calm down, but as they grew silent, he asked them, what would you have me do with Jesus? I was shocked at what I heard when one of the chief priests, with such hate and venom in his voice, shouted and began chanting, crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him! Pretty soon it was 5 and 10 and 20, and then the whole crowd was cheering and calling for the death and the murder of Jesus, this Jesus that loved them, this Jesus that taught them, this Jesus that did nothing but lay his life down and love them and serve them and feed them and heal them, and now they're calling for his death. Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate couldn't get the crowd to be quiet, and so I watched him whisper in the ear of one of his servants, and he disappeared, and he came back with a basin of water, and I watched as Pilate slowly, methodically began to wash his hands in a show of demonstration that caused the crowd to die down. And Pilate said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And almost without thought, someone from the crowd shouted, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children," came another voice. And so Pilate ordered that Jesus be taken to the headquarters. And this is where the real nightmare began for Jesus. Because awaiting in the headquarters was a garrison of troops. And what I want you to know about them is that a lot of them were conquered people. A lot of them used to be a part of other nations that Rome dominated, and then they enlisted them into service, and so they hated the Jews. Because to them, the Jews were a picture of, well, you think you're better than us? We submitted. Why won't you submit? Why won't you just get in line? Why won't you just do what you're supposed to do? And they took out all their hatred and anger on Jesus. They started with mockery. "You're a king? Where's your crown, your majesty?" And almost as a joke, someone presented a crown of thorns, and another soldier grabbed it from him and shoved it on the head of Jesus, beating it into his brow as these thorns began to cause Jesus to bleed. Another person grabbed a reed, and after striking Jesus with it multiple times, put it in his hand and said, "Your scepter, your majesty." They brought a scarlet robe and put it around him, and they began to mock him, "Hail, King of the Jews." Pretty soon their mockery turned to pure violence as they spat in his face, ripped out his beard. They punched him. One soldier would hold him, another would punch him. Jesus would fall down, and just as he's about to get back up, they'd kick him down again. And then they led Jesus out to the courtyard, and they threw him over a block of wood. And they took a whip, and in that whip there were shards of glass and bone and metal. Now the Jews had a law that you couldn't exceed a certain amount of lashes. The Romans had no such law. And they mercilessly, time and time again, whipped Jesus. They would hit him with the whip, and then the bone and the glass and the pottery would get stuck in his flesh, and they'd rake it down, ripping his flesh from his body so that his bones were exposed. When they were done, they put a crossbeam on his shoulders and forced him to march. It wasn't very far, it was just a couple of 100 yards, but Jesus was so weak from the beating, he couldn't carry the crossbeam. And so they got someone else to carry it to a place called Golgotha. And there they laid the crossbeam on the main beam. And they took nails and they pierced Jesus' hands, pinning him to the cross, and they pierced his feet. And they raised up his cross. And above him they put a sign that said, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." Further mockery. As Jesus hung there, he was totally exposed, completely humiliated, and people walked by and spat in his face, made faces at him, people that he loved, people that he healed. None more so than the religious leaders. They mocked him relentlessly. They said things like, "He saved others." Remember when he healed the guy? And he said, which is easier to say, "You're healed," or "Your sins are forgiven"? Remember, he saved others. He can't save himself. The liar. He believed in God. Where is his God now? The heretic. "Oh, you're the king? Okay, I believe that you're the king. Only come down from the cross, and then I'll believe you." Suddenly, Jesus let out a loud cry, and the sky grew dark. The crowd grew silent, and the mockery stopped because they thought he was calling Elijah to help him. He let out another cry, and they said, "Let's wait and see if Elijah comes and rescues him." As the sky grew dark, I looked at the foot of the cross, and I saw Mary, Jesus' mom. She'd been a mess the whole time, of course. But all of a sudden, she let out a loud, bone-chilling cry of agony. And I realized in that moment that Jesus was dead.
It's Friday. Jesus is praying. Peter's asleep. Judas is betraying. But Sunday's coming. It's Friday. Pilate's struggling. The council is conspiring. The crowd is vilifying. They don't even know that Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The disciples are running like sheep without a shepherd. Mary's crying. Peter is denying. But they don't know that Sundays are coming. It's Friday. The Romans beat my Jesus. They robe him in scarlet. They crown him with thorns. But they don't know that Sunday's coming. It's Friday. See Jesus walking to Calvary. His blood dripping, his body stumbling, and his spirit's burdened. But you see, it's only Friday. Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The world's winning. People are sinning, and evil's grinning. It's Friday. The soldiers nailed my Savior's hands to the cross. They nailed my Savior's feet to the cross. And then they raised him up next to criminals. It's Friday. But let me tell you something, Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The disciples are questioning what has happened to their king. And the Pharisees are celebrating that their scheming has been achieved. But they don't know it's only Friday. Sunday's coming. It's Friday. He's hanging on the cross, feeling forsaken by his Father, left alone and dying. Can nobody save him? Oh, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The earth trembles. The sky grows dark. My King yields his spirit. It's Friday. Hope is lost. Death has won. Sin has conquered. And Satan's just a laughing. It's Friday. Jesus is buried. A soldier stands guard, and a rock is rolled into place. But it's Friday. It is only Friday. Sunday is a coming.